Let me just first introduce Secretary Albright and then Secretary Cohen. I've had the great pleasure to work for both of these individuals. Everyone knows Secretary Madeleine Albright and the extraordinary career she's had both as a professor at Georgetown University and also as a public servant. She served as our Secretary of State in the second term of President Clinton. One of the great pleasures of my career was working for Secretary Albright as her spokesperson in her first year and then as ambassador to Greece. And she is someone who has stood up for our values, including democracy and human rights. Her whole life story is a commitment to the United States. And I want to ask you all to welcome Secretary Albright here. And I also want to ask you to welcome former Secretary of Defense, former Senator William Cohen here. He should be welcoming us because the Cohen group, of which he is chair, is right upstairs. I have the pleasure of being a senior counselor for the Cohen group, happily so. Secretary Cohen, Senator Cohen, Representative Cohen came to Washington in the early 1970s, served on the House Judiciary Committee during the impeachment proceedings against President Nixon at another time of a leadership crisis in Washington, moved to the Senate in 1978, was one of those people who became one of the acknowledged experts in the Senate on American defense policy and foreign policy, served for several decades in leadership positions in the Senate, and then became Secretary of Defense for President Clinton and served with Secretary Albright as part of the leadership team in the cabinet. We couldn't have two better people to discuss this big issue of America's future as a global power. This conference this summer, the book that we're inaugurating today, is about whether or not Republicans and Democrats can work together to preserve the leadership role that we've had. And so, Mr. Secretary, since this is your home turf, I want to start with you, and I'll ask you and Secretary Albright the first question together, and that is, are you worried that we're losing, are you worried that we're losing our leadership position to the challenge from Russia and China, to the changes in the global economy, and also to this big debate inside, are we still willing to be a leader? Is there a consensus in the country on that?
Short answer is, of course I'm worried. I think everyone in the country should be worried because we really haven't decided what our role in this new world of disorder is going to be. And I think starting at the presidential level, there is no coherent philosophy that is guiding us in terms of who are we, who do we want to be in this world, what can we be, and how do we go about bringing that to pass. So I think it should be of concern because we're not living in a unipolar world or a bipolar world or a multipolar world. We may be living in a nonpolar world, which may be the most dangerous of all. But I think for me, the concern is that we seem to be ceding international leadership in many different levels. And I think while the president has promoted Make America Great Again, he's doing it on a basis, it seems to me, of transactional activities without a comprehensive plan of how the individual components or transactions actually fit into the pattern that is cohesive and continuous. It depends on where one goes in terms of the impression that other countries have of us. If you go to Japan, I think the Japanese Prime Minister would say he's very fond of President Trump and what he's been saying. If you go to Saudi Arabia, the same thing would be said. If you go to our European friends, less so. If you were to talk to the Prime Minister of Australia, who's worried that the United States is no longer, can be counted on to carry the leadership role for freedom and democracy, and we need to continue to fill that role. So it depends on where you go. My own fear is that we are seeing a wrecking ball being taken to the institutions which we have worked very hard to construct. Not unusual. Most presidents come into Washington and they look at the White House or the institutions and say, Carpet needs to be repaired. The walls are a little bit thin. Let's have some remodeling done and to upgrade our capability. I don't see that yet. I'm hoping that will be the case. But if you're going to tear down institutions which you think no longer work, then tell me who the architects are, what their plans are, who the masons are, who the carpenters are, and tell me what kind of an institution or building you're trying to construct. And I haven't seen that take place. And so I worry about it. I worry that other countries are turning away from us. Chancellor of Germany saying Germany will have to go forward into the future without the assurance that the United States can be counted upon. That's a very big change in our relationship with Germany. We have a similar type of friction with our partners, the British. And you go around to our allied partners, and they worry that there's no consistency, that no predictability. Now, the president likes to say, I want to be unpredictable. That's what I've done all my life. I like keeping people on their heels or on their toes, but I like being unpredictable. Well, in geopolitics, it doesn't quite work that way. The people that I talk to, and I just returned from India and elsewhere, they would like more predictability. They want more continuity. They want to be able to gauge the reliability of the policies that we are articulating and identify who is actually speaking for the president other than the president. So I worry about these because I look at China, and I've been going to China since 1978. I look at what has happened in 35 and 40 years, and I say, this is dramatic, it's remarkable, it's transformational, it's admirable, and somewhat intimidating. That there's a country that has a vision, a strategic vision. They know where they want to get to. They have very few inhibitions on how they're going to get there. There's no Congress to contend with. There's no Supreme Court to contend with. And so you can see what their goal is, and they have a capacity to carry it out. That's not necessarily true on the part of the United States because we're a democracy. We take time. We debate. But the biggest criticism I hear is there is no plan, identifiable plan on what our role is going to be in the future, other than let's make a bilateral deal. And I think that doesn't work in the geopolitical world. I'll stop here because Secretary Albright needs to comment on that.
Thank you very much. And I was remiss in one fashion in my introduction to Secretary Albright. I noted that Secretary Cohen chairs the Cohen Group. Secretary Albright chairs Albright Stonebridge as well. So we have to give equal time to our sister consulting firm in Washington. Secretary Albright, I'd ask you the same question from this perspective. I just returned from a trip last week to Germany, the Czech Republic, and Slovakia, and you know this space better than anybody. In Poland, Hungary, and now the Czech Republic, your native country, we see anti-democratic, nationalist, populist forces taking over two governments, maybe even the Czech government. But I came away listening to the Europeans. I don't think that they believe that we're any longer the leader of the West, the way that every American president, Republican and Democrat, has been deemed to be. Is this a fundamental point of departure in how we understand our leadership?
I'm concerned that it actually is. And let me just say, it was terrific always to work with Secretary Cohen. We proved bipartisanship, and we spent a lot of time together, and it's great to be with you here. Let me just say, I think there are an awful lot of contradictions that are out there at the moment and need to be put within some kind of historical context. I am a pre-World War II person, but mostly my life as a functional human being happened after World War II. And we had a phase there afterwards when the United States was obviously the winner of World War II and also in the position of creating the institutions that really govern everything that we've been involved with. And that period saw us in a mortal fight, I think, with the Soviet Union. And every policy that the United States undertook, whether it was assistance or defense policy or financial issues, was done in the context of the world being divided into the red, white, and blue. And so then that ends with the fall of the Berlin Wall. And then we are in a second phase. And I have to say, first at the UN, then as secretary, I was privileged to be a part of looking at what our policy should be, and with Bill in the second term, within this entirely new aspect of things where the Soviet Union no longer existed and the countries that you mentioned all of a sudden become independent. I think we're now in a third phase, and one that I think, Richard, you really pointed out, the technology, I think, plays a very large part in that, in every way, in affecting us. And so the question is, what is the role of the United States within an entirely new construct? And actually, President Clinton was the first one to use the term indispensable. I just said it so often about the United States that the term became identified with me. But there is nothing about the definition of indispensable that says alone. It just means that the U.S. needs to be engaged. And I fully do believe that for the world to function, the U.S. needs to be engaged. And I am really concerned that we are becoming the dispensable nation. And that if I were president or others were in office, by the way, the sit room looks quite different than when we were there. They have fixed it. But I think that the bottom line is that there is a question about how one presents America. And I find it appalling that our president at the moment is talking about that we're victims of everything and that nobody wants to do anything with us, and all of a sudden everybody's taken advantage of us. That is not the America that I think is necessary at this point. And so I do think that we need to figure out what our role is in this third phase. But specifically to the question that you asked, and that is that I do think most of the things that have happened are really a double-edged sword. So what happened after, well, certainly with the fall of the wall, but also globalization has created an interaction among all of us, and I think most of the people in this room, we've all been beneficiaries of globalization. The problem, however, is that it's faceless, and people want an identity. And what is interesting is the countries of Central and Eastern Europe, next year we're going to be celebrating the creation of most of those countries after World War I. And the bottom line is they were created on the basis of national identity after the end of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And so with the facelessness of globalization, especially those countries, and obviously others in the Middle East, are now into identity politics in so many ways, whether it's linguistic or ethnic or religious. And that's fine. I believe in patriotism. What I don't believe in is nationalism and hyper-nationalism that in fact creates, if my group doesn't like your group, then I think it is very dangerous. So that is the double-edged sword. There's also a double-edged sword to technology, which is, we all like to talk about the woman farmer in Kenya who no longer has to walk zillions of miles to pay her bills. She can do it on the mobile phone. But technology has done something else, which is to disaggregate us to a point where it's difficult to have political parties and try to figure out how we belong, and we all listen to echo chambers of what we already believe in. I try desperately to listen to things I don't believe in, which would make it stay out of my way when I'm driving as I listen to right-wing radio. But the bottom line is I think we do need to do that. And some of you have heard me say this, and that is the following, and I apologize for plagiarizing because I tell my students not to do that, but I stole this line from Silicon Valley. People are talking to their governments on 21st century technology. The governments listen to them on 20th century technology and provide 19th century responses. And so there is no faith in institutions. So there are the issues about where the U.S. stands internationally, what is happening nationally with institutional structure, and I think we are at sea. And I fully agree with Bill in terms of saying, personally, I do teach. I am waiting for the national security strategy to come out, since I have them from all the previous administration, and I teach off of them because we know how they're made. I mean, it is complicated. It is the bureaucracies at their best working to produce documents that get okayed by the principals committee that emerge, and you actually have some clue about where the administrations are going. And we have absolutely no clue at a time that the world is at one of our more dangerous moments.
Thank you very much. And I think that national security strategy is going to be out momentarily from the Trump administration. I want to ask you both about the two big autocratic powers that we have to contend with, Russia and China. And then we're going to open this up to questions from the guests here. Starting with Russia, you both know this brief exceptionally well. Here's a country that has annexed Crimea, that has troops in the Donbass illegally, is dividing Ukraine, one part of Ukraine from another, is pressuring the Baltic states, has already kept Moldova and Georgia off balance. And our intelligence community is united in saying that the Russians launched an attack of sorts on our elections in 2016. They intervened in the Dutch, French, and German elections this past year. If you were both in office now, working with President Trump, what would you advise that he do to contain the more pernicious aspects of Russian power in Europe and in our own country, but also, by necessity, on Iran, North Korea, Afghanistan, find a way also to have a channel open to them? Secretary Cohen.
Well, the first thing I think that has to happen is we have to remove the cloud that's hanging over Russia and Russia's involvement and attack upon our democratic system. I think as long as the cloud continues to hang over the White House with these unresolved issues, it's going to be very difficult for the president to either take a positive, make a positive approach to the Russians. I think everybody in this room would say we need to have a better relationship with Russia. Russia's a big country. It's 11 time zones. They have nuclear weapons. They can be a cause for great instability and can cause instability. So it would be important for us to have a positive relationship with Russia. That cannot take place as long as this cloud of doubt is hanging over the White House in terms of what is the nature of this relationship between the president and Putin. And as long as there is suspicion and cynicism about what has either taken place or what someone wants to take place, I think it's going to be hard for us to formulate a policy that can do both things, namely continue to punish the Russians for their past behavior in Crimea, in Georgia, and certainly their attack upon the United States, digital attack that's been launched against us at the heart of our democracy. We're not going to be able to do that unless that cloud is removed. So I have, from the very beginning, tried to talk about this publicly, that I thought the president has to take action to remove that by, number one, I ask the questions, what do you own, Mr. President? What do you owe? And to whom do you owe it? If you answer those questions and clear away the ambiguity, now, I don't know this, here's what I believe. I believe there's a ton of Russian money in the Trump real estate. Nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with that at all. The Russians have been investing in real estate and when the president was in private enterprise. So the question is, but why have any inhibition about disclosing it? And that's where I think the doubt and the cynicism comes, is something that doesn't quite fit in this picture. That you can criticize the British Prime Minister, the Chancellor of Germany, the Australian Prime Minister, call the President of South Korea an appeaser, and never once say a word of negative criticism toward Putin, who has done things at the international and now our national level, which are appalling. So I think it's going to be hard. I would intensify the sanctions against Russia. I would go after more of their individuals. I would deny them the one thing they want most, and that is respect. That is what President Putin, for as long as he's been in power, wants Russia to be respected, and he should. It's a country with a great history, with great scientists and mathematicians and artists and writers. He wants his country to be respected. Well, if you want respect, you have to act respectfully. And he has not been acting respectfully, and I think he has been engaged in activities which have been contrary to the established norms that we expect of a great country. So I would not allow him to have that status until such time as there's been a modification of behavior.
Well, I believe it would be nice if the cloud were lifted, but the bottom line is I think it'll just go deeper because the cloud is more than a cloud. And I think that we have to be very concerned about what has gone on. I do believe that Putin has played a weak hand brilliantly. He is a KGB officer. We never can forget that. And he has played us in an unbelievable way. And we always talk about containing Russia. They are trying to contain democracy by the kinds of things that they are doing, that they have done in the United States and evidently are doing throughout Europe, as you pointed out. And I think they have made a very strong play for at least equal assessments of what is going on in the Middle East. I think they are also, when I was secretary, Yevgeny Primakov was the foreign minister, and he was known a lot about asserting Russian power in the Middle East. He would be very proud of what is going on now, because the Russians have become equal partners on Syria, and they have helped support Bashar Assad there. He has also very much played the game generally, playing with Israel and a number of different issues. And so I think that they have played a weak hand well. And we have to be very concerned because they are systematically making it more and more difficult for us to carry out what we need to carry out and have weakened us. And Putin has already made clear he's going to run forever. And one thing that he has done that he's been brilliant about, in the early 90s, I went and I did a survey all across Europe and did questionnaires and focus groups, and I'll never forget the focus group outside of Moscow. This man stands up and says, "I'm so embarrassed. We used to be a superpower, and now we're Bangladesh with missiles." And what has happened is Putin has managed to keep the Russian people in a weakened economy by having restored their so-called dignity, by doing what he's done in Crimea, all the pressures that you pointed out, and trying to contain democracy.
I want to ask both of you a follow-up question on this, and it's how we conduct American leadership and diplomacy in the world. It's a surreal environment when 2 weeks ago, on one day, the British Prime Minister and the Archbishop of Canterbury felt compelled to criticize publicly the President of the United States. I'm quite confident that has not happened since 1783, the Treaty of Paris. And then similarly, over the weekend, you had this situation where the president at his rally in Pensacola went after Angela Merkel and the NATO allies publicly. And having just returned from Europe and seen the sensitivity of the European allies to this persistent public criticism juxtaposed to the president's embrace of Duterte and Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin, what has produced this? And what are the consequences for our credibility as a result?
Sure, what has produced it? You have a president who was elected who had very little, if any, experience in the political world. He came with no serious level of, in my judgment at least, curiosity about the geopolitical situation. I was listening to Steve earlier, and he said, trade first and geopolitics should follow. I'm not sure that's quite right. I think they are almost inseparable. When we're talking about TPP, I'll give you another example. I was in Beijing the day after the election last year. I had voted early and went. I was meeting with a high-level Chinese official, and we were having dinner at his office, and he asked me, he said, now that President Trump has been elected, does that mean that TPP is dead? And I said, regrettably, yes. And he reached over and he touched me, he said, good, good. Now, it was good from the Chinese perspective. It was not good from our allies' perspective, the ASEAN countries. To a person, they came here in the spring and appeared over at CSIS and gave a presentation. And they indicated that, number one, we wasted 7 years with you. 7 years we wasted negotiating this deal. And then number two, you undermined our credibility with our own constituents. So that was a sentiment that was deeply felt. Beyond the trade issue, it was one where we were the ones who were going to be the leaders of the architecture for an economic policy that we would lead. And now the situation is such where the Chinese determined to set up an economic system which is socialism with Chinese characteristics. And that means they will take the leadership role, or trying to take the leadership role. So trade has an interconnection with geopolitics, and they can't be separated, in my judgment. And what it says is that the president has yet to decide what our role is going to be. You have Mr. Bannon, who's an advisor of his, who would like to see a less engaged role on the part of the United States. Let the Europeans take care of Europe. NATO has not been doing as much as it should, and he's right. By the way, the president is not wrong in suggesting the NATO countries have not paid up in terms of making a contribution that they should have made. I made that argument. I think Secretary Albright has made the same argument. Bob Gates has made it. Every Secretary of Defense, including Jim Mattis. So he's not wrong in saying they have to do more, but the way in which you do it sometimes matters more than what you're asking. So if you insult people, if you criticize them publicly as opposed to dealing with them privately, that tends to create friction there. So you can see this playing out. The Europeans feel that we have disengaged from their affairs. It started during the Obama administration, when we were going to, quote, pivot from our focus on Europe to the Pacific. May have been bad words that were chosen on that. The signal that was sent was not a positive one. And so the Europeans started to feel that we were distancing ourselves and looking east and not looking west to them, or east as far as they're concerned. So I think the policy, we've got to decide, we are suffering from war fatigue. That's clear. The American people say, hey, we've been at this a long time now. We spent a couple of $1 trillion. It's time for us to take care of nation building at home. And that's a sentiment the president has tapped into, and there's justification for that. It's time we do address things at home. But you can't do that at the expense of disengaging from global affairs, because when you do, other countries fill the gap. China's filling the gap in Asia. Russians are filling the gap in Syria. They're moving into Egypt. They're establishing influence in the Middle East, and they're also working on North Korea as well. So when we pull back, they move in, and that does not work to our advantage.
Well, I do think that, I know this president wants to be remembered for being the greatest whatever. He will have, in fact, been the one that diminished American power more than any single president. And I think that is not a record that any of us should be proud of, because I do not believe the world works if the United States is not engaged, and we're seeing it. And, you know, the Chinese are talking about one belt, one road. They must have a very large stomach, because their belt keeps getting bigger and bigger. And they are more and more interested in taking our place everywhere. I've just been to Argentina, and we did a lot of discussion about what the Chinese are doing in terms of investing all through Latin America. They are everywhere where we are not. And so I think this is a time to be very concerned about this. And what I don't understand is the contradiction among the American people in terms of, I have always, you know, when at sporting events or Olympics or wherever, we always have to be number one. And all of a sudden, we don't want to be a part of anything. And America First is not number one. America First is isolationist, is a country that does not know how to operate internationally, or in fact, trying to determine where we protect our people the best. So I am stunned by this, and I'm stunned by a lot of contradictions in terms of, you know, the title of this is is there an overturning of the liberal order? I believe that we're in danger, which is why a book that I'm writing that is coming out in April is called Fascism, A Warning. And I think we have to be very, very careful about the things that are going on in terms of people in the working class people who feel they've been left out of things, who are very angry, who don't want regulation from Washington, but do want a strong leader. And so I think that there are very many things that we need to look at history, what's going on here. And I have tried for the last year to be polite. I've had it. Because I think we do have to say what is going on here. Because there are some very dangerous aspects in terms of that some of us have thought, well, this will go away. But there are so many things being put into place at the moment, and the end of TPP being, you know, the whole thing that has now happened of the Chinese running what is left over, I think is of great concern. What is happening with our budget, I thought you were, you know, I think the fact that they're dismantling the diplomatic service is stunning to me. And what has happened is, in terms of respect, Secretary Tillerson now goes abroad having been gamed by what is going on here, and he does not have the respect that he needs to go talk to the Europeans or anybody. And so I think we need to say enough is enough here, that we need to figure out a way that people ask me to describe myself grateful American. I came here when I was 11 years old. Nothing was more important in my life than becoming an American citizen, and the respect that people had for America. I do not wish to end my life by not seeing America as respected and strong as we need to be to make the world a better place.
I agree with what Secretary Albright and I, who have worked arm in arm on so many issues together. In fact, I don't think we could have claimed victory in Kosovo without Secretary Albright taking a leadership role and pushing for our active intervention in that conflict. I want to come back just for a second on this issue of having a philosophy or a strategy as such. I watched Secretary Tillerson at CSIS gave a speech about a month ago, and I was sitting in the front row listening to it, and I was really quite impressed. I was sitting next to the Indian ambassador, as a matter of fact, during that time, but Secretary Tillerson laid out a vision, at least he saw, for our relationship. But what really caught my eye, or ear, I should say, is that he kind of went out of his way to say China is an important country, but it's India that the United States looks to the future as our strategic partners, not China. And he went on several times to say that and make that a very definitive point. And I thought it was interesting that he would be that forward-leaning toward India as the president's getting ready to go to China. And then I thought, well, maybe it has been a good cop, bad cop situation where he's laying a little foundation for dealing with Xi Jinping, that, by the way, we're looking to India, and that's a country as big as yours. It's not where you are now, but it hopes to be at some point. But the point was that Tillerson's speech, to me, laid out at least the blueprints for U.S., India, India, Japan, U.S., Japan, India, Australia, U.S., Australia. That's a quad, so to speak, a relationship between the U.S., India, Japan, and Australia. The Indians so far have been willing to think in terms of a trilateral, U.S., India, Japan. They've been a little more reluctant on the Australia component, not because they don't share similar ideals with Australia, but because when you start looking at the Quad, it looks more like potentially a containment strategy of China. And the Indians do not want to have the United States think that we're playing an India card against China. So we have to be careful in that respect. But to me, it gets back to this fundamental notion of what is in our interest. Our interest is to establish relationships with democratic countries who share our interests and our ideals. And to the extent that we can do that, we're not trying to contain China, but we're trying to send the signal to the Chinese. We know you're a growing, certainly economic power. You're going to be a big military power. But we want you to use that power in a way that's integrated into the international system and not for either aggressive or destabilizing purposes. And so we're going to build these relationships with all of the countries that share our interests and ideals. And we're going to make sure that we hold those relationships close to us. Now, the danger I see from what has been happening is that we're pushing away some of those allies. We insult them. We do not pay the respect that they deserve. And As a result, they're pulling away from us. I think that's the danger that I see, that we are not cultivating and nurturing the people and the countries who share interests and ideals and opportunities. And that, to me, is one of the great problems we're going to face in the future.
Thank you. At the Aspen Strategy Group, we are focused on bipartisanship, nonpartisanship. I would say for this next question, I want to ask you about China and North Korea, that there's been a consensus in the George W. Bush, Barack Obama, and at least at the cabinet level in the Trump administration, that, Mr. Secretary, what you were talking about, the development of a close strategic military partnership between the United States and India, joined by our alliance with Japan, that at least that triangular relationship, sometimes joined by Australia, is not going to, it's not the C word, not going to contain China, but the M word, manage China's rise to power, limit the ambitions of the Chinese running roughshod over their neighbors in the South and East China Sea. I think there's a Republican-Democrat consensus on that. The problem is we haven't heard that from the president, and it gets back to your first observation, what is the strategic plan? So let me ask both of you on this question. Shouldn't we give President Trump some credit on China and North Korea? He has developed a relationship with Xi Jinping. He's prioritized that, beginning in March at Mar-a-Lago. One can argue that the president's gotten more out of the Chinese with some of their sanctions against North Korea than previous presidents have, that the Chinese now are engaged perhaps because they fear that President Trump might initiate military action against North Korea. Are we close to war? Do you think that there is a high probability of a preemptive war, a strike by the United States? Or do you think this is more kabuki in the sense that we're really trying to drive this to negotiations? I think you can probably make the case for either, but maybe just Madam Secretary, we'll start with you and then go to Secretary Cohen.
I mean, I have to say, I'm not sure I agree that we have developed a better, or that the president has gotten something out of the Chinese. I'm not sure that they are doing everything they could as far as North Korea is concerned, because their concern is more that the place will fall apart, but they haven't cut off some of the major aspects of the support for the Chinese economy. And in the meantime, they're mucking around in the South China Sea, and in fact taking over climate change and a variety of other things. And I do think that the celebrations of Xi Jinping now are putting him into a greater and greater role. And what worries me actually is what you said, is that you think that he's gotten something out of the Chinese. So that is worrisome. I am very worried about what's happening in North Korea. I am still, believe it or not, I am still the highest level sitting official to have gone to Pyongyang to meet with this guy's father. And that I'm very glad that the United Nations has sent over an envoy, and I understand now that Dennis Rodman's going back, and that will be really useful. And
the UN envoys are former American diplomat Jeff
right,
Feltman.
Which I think he's a very smart person, and he knows, and the fact that the UN is more interested in it. But I think what makes me nervous is an accident. And I think that part of the problem, as we know, you need to have hotlines, and you need to have some kind of mill connections. And so I think it is worrisome, and I think it's unclear where the Chinese are. What surprises me is that the Chinese and the Russians, if in fact there is now some hydrogen test, or already whether there's some radioactive fallout from the test that they've already taken, that they don't see that that affects their people, and that they're going to have to be more helpful. But I don't see them. You know, the votes in the UN are nice, but they are not dispositive, I think, in terms of some of the sanctions aspect.
I agree with Secretary Albright that I think the Chinese can be doing more because the North Koreans have had, and this goes back to LBJ days, but they've had a guns and butter policy. They've been able to develop their guns, and the Russians and the Chinese have been giving them the butter. And in fact, if you look at the economic situation, the economy of North Korea has actually been improving. It's actually growing. There are actually some signs that there is some entrepreneurship taking place thanks to the support they've been getting from the Chinese and the Russians and others. So I think the Chinese they're in a position to do much more. They're reluctant to do much more. And they constantly say they fear that if there's a collapse of the North Korean regime, that there'll be millions of people flooding into China. I've always asked the question, I think there'd be millions of people trying to get into South Korea, which if I were there, I'd head south rather than north. But nonetheless, and you can see that from the defector who took a number of shots to get over the wall, that he was heading south, not north towards China. I think they're playing the long game. They feel, this I am speculating now, but they feel that the long game, they benefit ultimately by having a divided Korea with Kim Jong-un still in power, with the United States still in a state of contention but not military action at this point, that as the North gets stronger, the South will get weaker because they'll have less and less confidence in the United States by virtue of the perception that we're pulling back, and that eventually the North Koreans will be able to unify the peninsula under North Korean control as opposed to South Korean control. So I don't know what changes that calculus for them. I think the president does deserve credit for ratcheting up the pressure, but I think there's always a danger. I think there's a danger when you start using words like fire and fury, we're going to eliminate you from the map. I think Henry Kissinger in his White House years said something that I've never quite forgotten. He said, an idle threat that's taken seriously can be helpful, but a serious threat that is treated as being idle can be catastrophic. So the issue becomes, if the president is making idle threats which get the attention and a positive response from the North Koreans or from the Chinese, that's good. But if we continue to make threats which are idle and are in fact serious, we could find ourselves in a situation that Madeleine just described, where something takes place very quickly and escalates almost immediately. So I think the way we have, my own recommendation for what it is well, we need to go back to the South Koreans and say, you've been slow in putting in the THAAD missile system. The Chinese have really come down hard on you, impeded your economy, and tried to slow this process down. You need to speed it up. It would be helpful if the president didn't go to South Korea and tell the South Korean president, not only are you going to take THAAD, but you're going to pay for it. And by the way, we're tearing up the free trade agreement. That didn't exactly build a lot of confidence in terms of what the South Korean president could do. But we have to impress upon the South Korean president, no, THAAD is coming in, maybe one battery or two batteries. I would put THAAD in Japan as well. Even though the Aegis system is moving from sea-based to land-based, I'd put the THAAD system there as well if the Japanese will have it. And I would increase their missile capability, both in Japan and South Korea, to say, look, if it's going to be a threat to our people, to our allies, to the Japanese, to those in Guam, to those in South Korea, the hundreds of thousands of people in the region who are U.S. citizens, you're going to be put at risk in the North here. And to the extent that causes any uncomfortableness on the part of the Chinese, that's not a bad thing in my judgment. I think it'll do more to bring a solution about rather than letting it keep kicking it down the can forever.
I think that one of the things, having described that we're in a third new era, that no matter who had gotten elected, this was going to be an incredibly complicated period with a lot of questions about how, people and institutions at age 70 need a little refurbishing. And so the bottom line is that there were many issues that needed to be worked on that require a subtlety and an understanding of the international situation that seems to be missing. And I think that is what worries me the most, is that no matter what, things would be hard. The issues that you mentioned, Bill, and all the different are very complex, and they require an understanding of some very basic issues and not just gut reactions. And so I really do think that what I hope very much that the team becomes increasingly stronger and operates together and works with members of Congress to try to figure out how we live in this third era of the post-World War II time.
There are reports this morning that Victor Cha is going to be nominated to be the American ambassador to South Korea, and I, for one, think that's a very fine choice. He's knowledgeable, he's strong, he knows the region. This would be a good sign. We haven't had an ambassador to Seoul throughout the crisis. We're just about out of time, but I have to ask you this. because it's probably the most important question for America in 2018. And it's such a hard question to answer. How close are we to war? I've been assuming, watching Secretary Mattis, who's a real professional, watching Secretary Tillerson, that a combination of sanctions, extended deterrence, the threat, of course, of the vow that we'll protect ourselves and our allies might be enough with China to maneuver the North Koreans at least towards some kind of diplomatic conversation, because we haven't talked to this government. As you pointed out, Madeleine, you're the only American senior official who's even been to Pyongyang. No one in this administration or the last ever met Kim Jong-un. It would seem to be that would be a necessary event before you thought about a preemptive American attack. But we hear consistently, at least in the rumor mill, that there are some in the administration who think we ought to consider a preemptive attack. So the question for both of you is, how close are we to war in 2018?
Well, I have, I'm often asked if I'm an optimist or a pessimist. I'm an optimist who worries a lot. And I think there's no reason to go to war. Because the course I teach at Georgetown, as I say, foreign policy is just trying to get some country to do what you want. That's all it is. So what are the tools? And my course is called the National Security Toolbox. There are a lot of other tools there besides the actual use of force. The threat of the use of force is something else, and I think what you said on THAAD and the exercises is very important. But I think we also need to figure out how to use the other tools together and try to figure out how to restore our credibility. Because I'm very glad Victor Cha's going, but it's not going to be an easy story there. And so I think it's a matter of how to work with Congress to, in fact, begin to restore our credibility so that we don't have war, because if it is, it's going to be a very disastrous one.
I think we should really activate an information warfare campaign. I think we should try and have a Korea-free radio-free Korea, and really saturate the airwaves as best we can to say, President Putin has said the North Koreans will eat grass if you put more sanctions on. And my answer was, let them eat grass, but also offer them some Texas beef that we now export to South Korea so that they can see, wow, life is good in South Korea. Life is not good in North Korea. I would create as much instability as I could on the part of the people of North Korea through information campaigns. In terms of going to war, I don't think anyone who's ever been in a position at the Pentagon or State Department would advocate that we take preemptive action. Military action, I mean, the reason this can has been kicked down the road since Richard Nixon is because the consequences of going to war are so horrific. So if we're talking about tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people might die, yeah, that's the reason the can's been kicked down the road. So the president is correct saying, I've got a mess I've inherited. Yes, but as you once said to the widow of an officer we lost in Niger, you knew what you were getting into. You were running for the highest office in the world, and problems come with this job. Yes, it's been kicked down the road. Now the issue is, what are you going to do with it? The danger for me is that we combine our show of military force with not so vague allegations or tweets and statements coming out of the White House that we are preparing for a fire and fury storm, coupled with, I think, General McMaster, who said we are closer to war than ever before. It then gets into the realm, well, could we start something by accident, misinterpretation, that he really feels we're coming with 3 aircraft carrier groups, with S-88 class submarines in the region, et cetera, coupled with the language that we're using. Now, if we're going to continue to use the language and yet not do anything, once again, that erodes the credibility of what the president might have in mind. He might be serious. It wouldn't be taken as being serious. So I think we're closer than some of the experts who've said we're 20%. I'd put it higher. I'd put it higher. I'd put it closer to 35 or 40%. just because I think that we have ratcheted up the language. We are putting more and more troops and resources into the region, I think it accentuates the possibility that there could be action taken by miscalculation that I don't think any military leader is going to recommend that we fire against them on a preemptive basis. I don't believe that, but it could happen.
I wish we had another hour to talk about this, but I want to thank Secretary Cohen, Secretary Albright for being with us, and thank you for your service to the United States. Thank you.